Life Between the Rails, an oral history of Union Pacific Railroad, is a project sponsored by the American Heritage Center in Laramie, Wyoming. The project was made possible by the Union Pacific Foundation. Life Between the Rails documented Union Pacific employee experiences with a focus on women and members of underrepresented communities. Most of the project participants hired on with UP in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s. They witnessed major changes within the railroad industry during their careers. In this video, their insights are poignantly shared in their own voices.
You have to remember, this was a changing time period. Women were coming into the workforce in male-dominated fields, and that did not set well with some people. I always felt if you did your job, then they treated you better. But, it was a different time.
I was on the same section crew my dad was. Back then when I started working, we used to use jacks to jack up the truck, and we used to tamp by hand.
Yeah.
And everything, now I remember pulling a bar by hand. And that's in 10 years. Mm-hmm. Everything was by hand. Oh, that's how I crippled my dad as time went on.
We were always upgrading the signal systems, which was always eliminated jobs. That was always the focus, was to make things run smoother, faster, with less people. Up until a few years ago, it was the main economic engine for Wyoming, southern Wyoming, because it had a lot of employees and a lot of industries and stuff that used it. So it was a real good economic engine for southern Wyoming, but that's all come to an end.
Working with so many people, it's like a second family. I think the thing I miss the most is my railroad family. I have not felt anything like that on any other job. And it didn't matter where we were from, as long as we worked for the railroad, we had that tie.
The technology side of the railroad is kind of the way that technology has completely taken over the operation of the railroad. It used to be almost entirely people-driven, and now it's almost entirely computer-driven. There isn't a whole lot of space for individual decisions or, seat-of-the-pants type stuff.
Well, all of the experiences on the railroad are unique, I think. The whole atmosphere is just something that's in your blood or something.
The previous clips gave a glimpse of some of the major themes touched on by project interviewees. Next, we'll focus on stories that reveal the unique character of railroading in Wyoming. Wyoming's landscape shaped the railroad experience unlike anywhere else. From brutal winds that could blow train cars off the tracks, to sun kinks that could buckle rails in the summer heat, to ground blizzards that turned the landscape into a whiteout, Wyoming tested everyone who worked on the railroad.
The railroad's a harsh mistress. And like somebody pointed out to me early in my career, the railroad runs like the river flows 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And when she calls, you better be there. One of the most delightful aspects of my railroad career were the people I worked with, particularly in trade and engine service. And the way I put it is this way. In a world full of skim milk personalities, the average railroad man is a chocolate molded, thick and rich. In fact, there were not only a lot of chocolate moldeds I worked with, there were more than a few hot fudge sundaes and even a small number of banana splits. That's what kind of thick personalities these guys were.
The challenge in the yard was all the dirt blowing when you're trying to work. Guys would wear goggles, they put Vaseline on their face, remember that?
Yeah.
People put Vaseline on their face because the dirt hit so hard and it hurt. And then you'd go to lunch and they'd just be all just full of dirt from the Vaseline all stuck to them. The wind was the worst part because it would cut out the radio. You'd try to say something in the radio and the wind would take them out, and I'm the engineer going, was that just static or did somebody say stop? And it's like, I'm in control, and it's like, I don't know, but I'm going to stop and find out what's going on.
We get them 100-mile-an-hour wind gusts up on top of Sherman Hill or at Rock River. I've seen trains blow off at up on the side of the hill, and Rock River we've had trains blow off, or actually blow off.
I've seen them. Yeah.
Looks like a box kite. So that's, that's a big problem.
Theoretically, from Omaha to San Francisco is all one rail.
Could be, well, except
Right.
It's what they call continuous welded rail. And so when it gets hot, it kinks. They call it a sun kink. That rail expands, and that straight track starts doing this.
And then they've got to get it back together again. You know how they do that?
How do they do that?
They'll go get a rope, about that big around, and they soak it in a bucket full of diesel fuel. And they go over there and they lay it right on the rail, and they light it. The first time I saw that, I said,
Hey, dude, you're an antique. They don't do that anymore.
I'm an antique, and that's what they did. They got that rail so hot that it just went right back together.
Now they use torches,
Oh.
Torches.
but they heat that rail up and it'll expand again, and they weld it together.
The rope method sounds more exciting.
It is pretty cool. If you've ever seen it, it is
Come around the corner and they're rope and rail. You're driving.
I saw a lot of that between Lemery and Rawlins. I saw a lot of that stuff when
especially
at night.
melting switch points.
Oh yeah, there's another one.
But the cab signals were great. I remember crossing eastbound during a winter ground blizzard. And if you look straight up from the windshield, it was blue sky overhead. And on the ground across Albany County, it was just blowing like double time and a half. You couldn't see, 10 yards in front of your face. We're going along at 70 miles an hour, almost completely blind. If you went by a block signal, you had about 1/10 of a second to read the block signal. All we were running on were the cab signals in the engine. And I felt, I was a little queasy about this, but I surely trusted those cab signals. And they got us through Albany County in that ground blizzard just fine.
The old Saratoga Encampment Valley Railroad, it ran from Walcott to Encampment. But we were plowing snow over there one time, and I think that the wedge plow is in Laramie now as part of their display. And it's just this big concrete filled thing, and we were plowing snow going to Saratoga to get to and at that time the bridge had been washed out and they never repaired it. So I was out on the highway, and Bernie was running the engines and helping Louie, and we kept breaking the air hoses, and when you do that, the train goes into emergency. So, it was one of those, you need to get the job done, guys. So we disconnected the air to the snowplow so we could, if the hoses came apart, we could just keep pushing snow. Well, right at Overland, where the Overland Trail marker is, you go down and you come over hill, and it's downhill all the way to Saratoga. And Bernie broke through the snowdrift and stopped the locomotives and panicked on the radio, called me up, and he said, I've lost the snowplow. He said, it broke loose. And there went the snowplow on its own, heading for So I drove as fast as I could to Saratoga and went over by the lumberyard, and as it rolled by, I managed to get on it and set the handbrake about 20 yards before I went in the river.
So you were riding the snowplow, basically.
I ran up and I drove my truck up and caught it, and then I jumped on it and set the handbrake. And I came down and got it, and we pinky swore that we wouldn't tell anybody that we did.
When women entered traditionally male railroad jobs in the 1970s and 80s, they faced physical dangers and skepticism. But they not only succeeded, they excelled, proving themselves while adapting to new technologies and building deep bonds with coworkers.
It gave me a lot more confidence knowing that I could do these different jobs that were not mainstream female jobs, knowing that I could learn carpenter helper, I could learn switchman, I could learn engineer. I think it gave me confidence overall.
And a sense of pride. you know, that you could do that.
Pride.
And
Keep
do
up with the
something
guys.
that, yeah, not everybody would want to do, but maybe some people can't do.
I think for me, the camaraderie, I still have really good friends who worked for the railroad. And you trust these people with your life and limb, literally. You know, if they make a move, you could get split in two or hurt really bad. So that life and limb kind of bonding and knowing the crazy schedule and the crazy lifestyle it was.
Right.
But some of my best friends are, well, railroaders.
Yes.
Ex-railroaders, retired railroaders.
Well, I was on a head of cars on the Walden Local up there in the snowbanks and the snowdrifts. And they were out of control. I had handbrakes that didn't hold. And the conductor finally said, "Danny, jump." And so I jumped in a snowdrift. You have no choice. If your cars are running away and going down the mountain, you better get the hell off, which I did. But that's a scary experience.
Did you get frostbite out there at work?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the sun's shining in Omaha, but Dale Junction is another story. And I did get my ears frostbitten and a few other things because it was so cold. And you know, the dispatcher would say, "Well, the sun's shining here in Omaha." And you'd want to just, if they were close enough.
But when I was in Green River, it was a really busy yard. And this was when you got on and off moving equipment, which is now, you don't do that. They have to come to a complete stop for you to get on, and a complete stop for you to get off.
Wasn't then.
But not then. And I would, you know, be the field man, which was the person way down in the tracks, and they'd be going so fast, these cars by me, I couldn't get on.
No.
And I thought, I've got to quit. I can't do this. And I told this one fellow, I said, I'm going to quit. I can't do the job. And he took me out in the yard while other people were, you know, while we weren't working, and he taught me how to get on.
Moving cars.
Moving cars that were going pretty fast. And then getting off and getting on. And we practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced. Today my knees tell me you shouldn't have probably done that.
Some of our challenges were being pregnant out here because we had a manager, we were talking about this earlier, we had a manager that was so, he just did not like women out here, especially if you were pregnant. And Kris hid hers for a long time, all of them. And I hid mine, and then the manager, because the managers were here, I was over there in that building over there, and he didn't come around that often, but he would hear the rumors.
And you wear bibs, you know.
You wear the big baggy bibs and you could hide it for a while. And they kept calling me and telling me, the dispensary says, you need to come in for your biannual physical. And I'm like, I'm not going in for the biannual physical because the manager had already told the doctors, pull me out of service. Well, I couldn't afford to be pulled out of service. And so I went to my doctor in North Platte. I took a day off, ran down to North Platte, went to my railroad doctor down there. He signed a piece of paper. I was good to go. He knew I was pregnant, said, call me when you want a paper to say you can't work anymore, you know, and I'm okay. And so the manager kept calling. He says, when are you going to make your appointment at the dispensary? And I says, I'm not. I've already got my letter. I've sent it in. And my doctor said I was good to go. And he did not want women out here that were pregnant at all. I was 6 months along, I think, when they opened up what they call a reserve board. And I went home for 70% of my wages voluntarily because they had so many people to work. And I went home my last few months of the pregnancy until my daughter was about 8 or 9 months old, which is not a maternity leave, but it was probably the best maternity leave anybody ever got. And that particular manager harassed women that were pregnant. He just could not handle it. He didn't want us to get hurt, and he didn't want us to have something happen to the baby too. He was worried about that, but he was a chauvinist anyways.
So he wasn't doing it out of the kindness of his heart as much as he just didn't think you should be there in the first place. That must have been tough to work with.
Yeah, she went through it 3 times. I just went through it once.
Then you only got 6 weeks off after the baby was born before they expected you to come back to work.
First computer screen I seen on a locomotive, I had just become an engineer. I'd looked at these gauges for years, you know, knew where to look when you set up the air and da-da-da. And I get a coal train up at the mine, and I walk in, and the engineer had stayed up there. Usually they come on down, and I walk in, and he goes, "Well, this is what I figured out." And he's starting to show me how this thing works. And I told that conductor, I said, we're not going anywhere until I know what's what. So we went around that coal mine circle over and over, so I set up the air. Okay, now what moves? That's crazy.
But we were working on a winter night, no wind, dead still, and we were on the east end, and the west end crew had kicked some cars into a track, and I was standing pretty close to the track these cars had been kicked into, and you couldn't hear a sound. You can't hear the cars on the rail or anything. It was just quiet. And all of a sudden Tim Leipold comes and tackles me to the ground because those cars were coming, and he saw them.
Oh, wow.
And they would have hit me had he not tackled me. He saved my life.
Latino families have deep roots in Wyoming's railroad history. They came for railroad work, settled along the UP line, and built careers despite facing discrimination, being denied jobs, facing prejudice, and even being pressured to leave their communities.
My grandfather worked for the Union Pacific Railroad. His name was Moises V. Hill. He was a section man. He initially worked out of Hatzel, Wyoming, which is it's nothing there now, but at one time there was some section homes there, about 20 miles west of Rollins here. When my mother was born, that's where my grandparents were living at that time. My grandfather, Moises, he came from southern Colorado and came up here to work on the railroad. His brother worked on the railroad in Laramie. He had a brother and a sister that lived in Laramie. So I have relatives over there. They all came up to work on the railroad. So there were quite a few of the people that lived in that particular area, the San Luis Valley in southern Colorado, that came up here to work for the railroad. I imagine it was probably the 20s or the 30s. So I worked as a conductor for two and a half years, almost 3 years. And then I was promoted, then I moved to be an engineer in 79. And from 79 till 2017, I worked as an engineer. But initially I was a brakeman in 1973 when I hired out. And back then, they had just passed laws on discrimination. You had to hire so many minorities and so many women, so on and so forth, as trainmen. Now see, my grandfather, as a section man, they almost solely hired minorities because that was hard work. They were working on the tracks back then. They didn't have a lot of the machinery and a lot of the technology that they have now. So they had to do a lot of that work by hand, moving ties and making sure that all the spikes were in place and so on and so forth. They I think once a week they'd walk the track. They'd have to walk so many miles of that track checking for loose spikes or rail and so on and so forth.
The men on South Side, some of them were relatives, some of them were neighbors, people that I worked with, that I grew up with. And yeah, they helped me out during this whole railroad experience.
And when you say South Side, is that a neighborhood?
On that side of town.
Okay, so south of the tracks and
yes.
Rollins.
And I used to see, my grandfather was a railroader.
Oh.
My grandfather retired when I was born. He worked maintenance on the train, and so he would ride on the train with it, and he would fix it on the way, like go all the way to where it needed to go and fix it.
So some of the repairs that your grandfather would make were on the
steam engine. Yeah, he would do a lot of the mechanical on the trains, and sometimes when I was growing up, he would take us with him on the train to Salt Lake or Colorado. Yeah, grandfather, he was a hard worker. And I used to see a lot of the men from Southside walking early in the morning, late at night, with their bags, walking up the hill to go to work.
What was your grandfather's name?
Steve Romero. He would always fix stuff. So I would ask him, how did you learn how to do whatever he was doing, plumbing or whatever? And he'd say, on the railroad.
Anyway, I tried hiring out for the railroad in 1965 to no avail. I tried in 66 when I come back out of the service. I tried in 76, 77, all the way up. Wait a minute. We go back to 73, that's when I hired out. But I tried since 65 up to that time, and I couldn't get on. They said no. And this dude's name was, what was his name? Rosenthal. He was the secretary of the trade master in Laramie. And he said, I'll give you a job, yeah, but you're going to go out there pounding spikes with your other people. Other people. I said, I don't want to do that. I want to be a brakeman, because you're hiring brakemen right now. But anyway, it finally happened on May the 16th, 1973. That's when I finally went to work after all those years of trying to get on. They started hiring, and I opened the door for all the Hispanics in Laramie.
The uncles generally were laborers of one kind or another, engine cleaners or repairers. Or my Uncle Carlos worked in the roundhouse for a long, long time. My Aunt Lupe worked also in the roundhouse, but she repaired the upholstery in the cars, and the passenger cars when they were still passenger trains. None of them wanted to be supervisors or foremen. First, they didn't want to lose union protection. Secondly, they did, my Uncle Frank particularly, the oldest of all the boys, he did not want to supervise some of his friends. And I suspect, because they've just hinted at it, that they didn't want to participate at all in the discrimination that was happening against their fellow workers. Whatever he did is when he was doing that work, he was working inside, whatever an engine starter did inside. But eventually he was working outside. It was a higher paying job, but he would come home literally with icicles in his nose and his ears and so forth.
When you began to look into some of those mass deportation events, did you find that there were relatives or neighbors that had been threatened with that, or did you learn about people in Cheyenne, from Cheyenne that had been deported? Or?
Oh, yes. And you'll see my Aunt Rosemary in her oral history. She talks very specifically about her friend Lucy, whose family left, and her father worked for the Union Pacific. But yes, there were a significant number. And later, my Uncle Frank told me, well, actually my grandmother told me, that that's how this orchestra got disbanded. You know, a lot of those families were sent away.
And you were telling me before about a family being offered a pass on the railroad. Can you tell that story?
Well, that's what my Uncle Carlos told me, that they would say, here, you can use this pass, this railroad pass,
and
to
it was
get to Mexico.
UP employee that literally came and knocked on the door.
John Scott, who I don't know if that's his real name, who said, here's the railroad pass. You don't even have to pay for anything. You can take you and your family.
But in this case, it was pressure being put on the family to leave the U.S. permanently, and the family were U.S. citizens.
Right.
Well, and I wonder about the involvement of the Union Pacific in that way. What was the advantage to them of
employing unemployed people who lost their jobs elsewhere? They could employ all whites. That was the whole Anglos. That was the whole idea.
It was a replacement.
plan. Mm-hmm.
The railroad evolved dramatically during these employees' careers. Many of the participants were trained by engineers who drove steam locomotives, then diesel. They themselves saw the advent of computer-controlled locomotives and communication via satellite. Some embraced the changes, others mourned what was lost. All of them witnessed a transformation.
I'm old enough that steam was still prevalent when I was a kid. My dad was a machinist in the roundhouse over here. And I remember many occasions coming into the roundhouse with him. He'd come down to pick up a paycheck or do whatever in the roundhouse. And that was really impressive. I mean, it was like a 3-story red brick affair. Of course, there weren't any other stories in it. It was just that's how tall they were. And I remember going in there, and the place was magical. And it would have scared me, except for I had my dad's hand, and at that point he was still God, you know. And so I go in there, and I don't know how many stalls the roundhouse had. Maybe 7, I don't know. But there would be a locomotive in almost every stall. And there'd be a pit underneath each one, and as soon as you walk in there, you could just, the place was alive almost. You could smell the fresh coal, you could smell the coal smoke, you could smell the grease. And a lot of the locomotives would have some steam built up in it so they could test whatever it was they were working on. And if they had steam in it, it was like the damn things were alive. They're like, whoa, whoa, and then there's always something clicking and snapping or letting off steam. And it was magical. And then in the pits underneath, you'd see the guys with the treble lights, and they'd be banging on stuff and cussing and discussing. It was fascinating. It was just fascinating.
Steam engine days, they didn't even have speedometers on the engines. You want to know how fast you're going? Use your watch and a milepost. And that's how you figure out how fast you were going. And these guys, they learned to run in the fog, they learned to run in the snow. And they knew, I mean, you could wake one of them up in the middle of the night and he'd know exactly where he was, probably within a half a mile. They were that good. We had air brakes, and that was it. And you had to learn to control the train going up and downhill, all that sort of thing. We used to say, give the conductor a good ride, and you've done a good job. So. And the old guys, when they started out, a 35-car train was a big train. Nowadays, it's 250 or 300 cars, something like that. Totally different. And you don't have somebody riding on the rear end that you have to worry about. But yeah, I can remember the conductor would get on the radio and say, "Hey, you knocked me on my butt back here. Well, just lay there for a while and I'll stand you back up in a few minutes." All of these locomotives now have GPS on them, and they have two-way computer communications with the headquarters. And if you want to see what a train's doing, you sit down and type in this, that, and the other, and you can see exactly where he is, how fast he's going, what throttle notch he's in, all this sort of thing.
Steve was a manager here that the engineer was actually running the train. I mean, and that lasted until about 2018. I retired in 2019. I could see the writing on the wall. I was old enough to go, but I could see they were taking the fun out of my job. I enjoyed running trains, and I enjoyed running trains fast. You couldn't, I mean, I would take them, I wouldn't violate the rules by speeding, but if I could run that train 70 miles an hour, I pegged her at 70. I enjoyed it. I took pride in my work. I have 3 people on a switch crew, 3 guys on the ground and an engineer running the engine. And a very good switch crew was a well-oiled machine. There was some, if they were good at it, they were always in the right position, and it flowed like a Swiss clock. It really did. You could handle a lot of cars and do it safely. And now there's only one person on the ground, and they don't move near as many cars in an 8-hour shift. They just can't.
One of the big things that happened with technology was putting in quarter-mile rail. That reduced a lot of the maintenance away, and they built that rail plant over in Laramie. and we ran rail trains both directions out of Laramie, and that was when the Union Pacific was going from jointed rail to quarter-mile rail, and it changed. There used to be sections all the way across Wyoming. It was instrumental in getting rid of them because then all of a sudden the track didn't need as much maintenance. In my career as an engineer, we saw, in my opinion, the first generation of locomotives, diesel electric locomotives, come through here, and then in the course of my career, we always got the new locomotives, not on every train, but when new locomotives got bought by the Union Pacific Railroad, they came through here, and if sometimes you'd get on a brand new locomotive. That was a lot of fun. Changing from a 2,000 horsepower to 2,500 horsepower to 3,000 horsepower to 3,500 horsepower to 4,000 horsepower is a big change in locomotives. The computerization of the railroad. We saw it in its infancy, and we saw it to, well, the way it is now, where the locomotives are run by computers now. We just saw a lot of change of the railroad coming into the 21st century and being pretty modern. Getting rid of the cabooses was a thing that was going to happen. It changed how we ran trains as engineers and how the railroad wanted trains run. And it was quite an art to run a train with two guys on the rear end and not hurt them running across Wyoming at 70 miles an hour. And when they got rid of the caboose, the conductor came up to the head end with us and made sure we rode the straight and narrow. You can talk to these guys at work now. It's just the phrase when I was retiring was, everybody puts their float in the parade in single file, here we go. And that wasn't the way it used to be. If you had a hot train years ago, they cleared the railroad for you and lickety-split, you went. And it was a lot of fun back then, running trains for the Union Pacific Railroad. A lot of fun.
Women worked for Union Pacific during World War II, stepping into roles throughout the railroad when men left for military service. 3 of our project participants shared memories of their mothers and aunts who worked on the railroad. In the following clips, Sally Meeker reads from her mother's autobiography. Carol Pascal shares the memories of 2 aunts who worked for UP. And Ricky Durrant describes his mother's work on the railroad.
She heard that there was work in Omaha working for Western Union. So she took the train to Omaha, and there was not a job for Western Union. And so she began working, and she started searching the newspapers, and now I'm reading from her autobiography, where she much better than I describes her experience. Also through the newspaper, I found the opportunity to attend a free telegraphy school for a 3-month course to prepare me for being a telegraph operator for the Union Pacific Railroad. Following 2 months of classes, the instructor called. Now the class was 3 months, but after 2 months, the instructor called for 3 student volunteers to go to Cheyenne, Wyoming for assignment, to Sherman Station, just south of Ames Monument, the highest point of the Union Pacific Railroad. I jumped at the chance to start at the top, and the very next day, Mary Fees, another girl just out of high school, and Eleanor, an older girl who had been in the Army, and I were on a train bound for the West. I was elated, full of confidence and excitement. On a blustery day, one of the days at Sherman when the chain stood straight out blowing in the wind, we arrived at the Sherman Depot where we were to live and work. The situation was much like my pre-teen days on the farm before moving to Texas. We had an outdoor privy, coal stoves for heat and cooking, bathing in an old wash tub, and carrying water from an outside pump across the tracks. As our truck arrived with furniture and supplies to furnish our new home, we actually considered not unloading it, but returning at least to Cheyenne. I can hear the clicking of the telegraph key, whose messages I never got very well. I can hear the familiar sound of a train approaching around the curve. I hear the shrill, mournful sound of the whistle, and the other sounds that could only come from an old steam-powered train. I took messages and orders from a dispatcher in Cheyenne and handed them up to train crews as they flew through. We worked 7 days a week, ordered our groceries from the company store in Omaha, and received them on the local train. Business was very heavy because of World War II, and the troop trains came through and all the troops would hoop and holler, and so there was some excitement to it. She accepted her job in September 1943. When she went to work on Sherman Hill, it was World War II and men were at war, and otherwise they would have been covering that job. So she received a man's salary, which I don't have a record of what that is, but she commented several times through her autobiography that she was making equal pay with a man at that time.
My Aunt Lupe worked also in the roundhouse, but she repaired the upholstery in the cars, and the passenger cars when they were still passenger trains. That was part of her doing, because I remember she would bring home these huge needles, these big round needles, to fix the cars and the seats in the cars of the uncles, and if they had a tear in them or something. She was able to take care of herself too. She was not going to allow this group of women, who probably didn't have the education she did.
And tell me about the event in this photo.
This is a picnic. It was a Union Pacific picnic that only women were invited to, and only white women. And she heard about it and asked about it, and they told her, you can't come. I gathered that it was either a unit or a union, or it was limited to Union Pacific workers. And that's why she went out there and said, well, I'll just stand here if I can't sit with you. My Aunt Rosemary, when she worked during the war, she prepared some of the meals and so forth for the passenger cars. Not that she cooked or anything, but she wrapped them, because she had a nice way of wrapping with paper and making it look fancy. There were a lot of troop trains, and so they made little packages of food for the troops too. And she wrapped them, and sometimes she didn't tell me this, but my Uncle Reuben told me this. She would write little notes like "Good luck" and we love you and so forth on the packages. So she got to work inside. Again, at some point, they replaced her with an English lady, and she went to work outside. They were either inside or outside. And so she said she couldn't wait for the war to be over, because the winters were really hard on her, and she was waiting for my Uncle Carlos to get back. He served in India.
And when your Aunt Rosemary did work outside, do you know what her tasks were?
Yes, she was an engine cleaner. She was an engine cleaner.
That sounds like a rough job. Really.
It was a very rough job.
Mom was a telegraph operator. So during World War II, she came from Arkansas. She was working in a ammunition plant, Southern Arkansas, as a slitter operator. She got allergic to the powder, so she went up to, that was Little Rock. So she went to Oklahoma in the Boeing plant helping assemble planes. She's in the blueprint. Well, then the railroads were offering a school in Denver for all telegraph operators. So she went out there, took the class. You had to take Morse code, handwriting, rules, safety, all that. And then she hired on for the UP. And she started working in Rollins as a telegraph operator and a phone operator. Then she went west to Wamsutter, Bittercreek. She skipped Green River, Carter, Evanston, or Altamont, then Evanston, Wasatch, and then Morgan, Utah. Then she went back to Wasatch, and that's where she met my dad.
Wow, she had quite a career. Can you give me what's her name and her birth, and is she still alive?
No, Mom is Mabel Durrant, Mabel Turner at the time, and she passed 5 years ago.
And when was she born?
1928.
In her 20s, while she was doing this work. I haven't heard of a woman from that time traveling as much as she did. Was that unusual?
No. Well, not for she was on the extra board for the clerks. It wasn't unusual.
It wasn't unusual for a female to be on extra board doing that work, huh?
Right.
During World War II?
Right.
How long did she do this work?
Till 47.
Okay, so after the war, because I know so many times men replaced the women in those jobs, so she kept going.
Yeah, nobody wanted to work Wasatch, so she was safe.
Okay, isolated. But that's where she met your dad?
Yes, Dad was a section foreman.
One of the delights of this exploration is hearing about the laughter that lightened the load and the peculiarities that kept the days interesting.
They were running a lot of coal trains out of Hannah, Wyoming. This is before the Powder River picked up. And we had a lot of trains were running out of Hannah. And I was working with an old head engineer named Jarvis Bartlett. He's from Laramie. His son worked on the railroad as a mechanic. And he was the engineer, and I was a student. And we're coming down Sherman Hill, and I'm just a couple weeks away from getting qualified. And he knew I had a need for speed. And he said to me, you know, there's a difference coming down that Sherman Hill, 60 miles an hour out of control on a train, or 60 miles an hour under control. I said, I'm a young kid, 24 years old. This old man's telling me this stuff. You don't know what you're talking about. 60, what difference does it make? Well, we come through Beaufort, and I got this, I'm running. Excuse me, I got this train set right on. We were restricted to 35 miles an hour down the hill. I got her sitting right on 35 miles an hour, and he's having this discussion. He's sitting in the brakeman seat having this discussion with me, and I'm arguing with him, which was, you're not supposed to do. And finally, he gets up and he comes over and he kicks the brakes off this coal train coming down. We're just coming down off the east end of Beaufort. And I said, well, if you're going to handle the controls when I'm running it, you do it. So I went to get up, and he put a paw on my shoulder, and he pushed me back in the seat, and he said, kid, if you don't set the air right now, we're not even going to stop in Cheyenne. And so down the hill we go, 65 miles an hour down Sherman Hill. We stopped just west of Wycon. There's a little dip there. He called it the Corlett Hole. Corlett Creek runs through there. And we come up on that little rise, and she come to a stop. And I mean, I had adrenaline sweat coming down my armpits. I got out of the locomotive, and I'm on the ground. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. And he says to me, I get back up on the engine. He goes, what do you think now? I said, yeah, there is a difference between out of control and under control. The next day, my road foreman calls me up, and he says, I heard you learned the difference between out of control and under control yesterday. And I said, yes, sir, I did. And he said, okay. Never forget it.
We had telegraph. And of course, one of the signs said, be brief on these telegrams. And so a little humor in this, out at Bitter Creek, that's as dry as a bone out in that Bitter Creek area. It's desert. And about every 10 years, they'd have some high water. There was a section foreman out there that used to send in messages to the roadmaster that was lengthy, and he got after him and said, be brief, be brief. So, well, they had this cloudburst that came in the Bitter Creek Valley, and he sent a telegram back to the roadmaster, and he said, the water is where the track was.
Early on in your career, you earned the nickname Killdozer.
Killdozer, yeah. I had several near-death experiences, I guess you could say, and you talk to anybody that knows me, and they say, I think he's on his 9th life, you know. But I did, I was over there working on a D8 by Fort Steele, Wyoming, and I was sent out to rip this hill with my rippers as a rock hill, a lot of rocks and stuff. And so I'd go back and forth over this trying to get this hill knocked down to build right-of-way road. So I'd take dirt off one side, take dirt off the other, and just start working back and forth on this hill. And as I was working up there, I looked down and there was this weird rock, a red rock with yellow and red, and I just kept ripping away. And so I got off for my lunch break, and I got down and I picked up the rock. I said, "Oh, this looks like a bunch of fusees." Fusees are those fuses you signal flares type of thing you can signal with at night. I said, "This looks like flares." And so I started scraping the ground. I uncovered this wooden crate box, and it said dynamite. So it had been dynamite that had been there for years. So I called my boss up and told him, I said, "You need to come over here." I said, "I got a bunch of dynamite I hit." "No, you didn't hit no dynamite," he said. I said, "No, there's dynamite up here." He said, "There's all these red sticks of dynamite." He goes, "No, those are just probably fusees some trainman threw out." And I said, "No, it's dynamite because it says that on the box." So man, he rushed right over there, and I got the dozer stopped right on top of it. And he came up there and he goes, "Oh my gosh," he said, "that stuff could have gone off any minute with that glycerin. That yellow crystal was glycerin leaking out of it, and it was just one sparkle set it off." And so then he got on the radio and called the Hannah mines, the coal mines there, and had the blasters come out to see what we could do. And the blasters come over there and they started uncovering stuff that they could. And they said, "Man, I can't believe this did not go off." They said, "It only takes a spark to set this glycerin off, and you've been over here running over it all day with your ripper?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "I guess I'm just lucky." And then they tell me all this, and they tell me, "Well, the only way we can find out what's there and to take care of this, we got to blast this hill. We got to put charges in there to blast it." And they said, "Well, you got to get your dozer off there." I said, "You just told me it would go off." I said, "Just said any sparkle set it off." So man, I just creeped that thing.
I can't believe you were able to do that.
Half an inch a second, and so I got it off the hill, and they went up and set charges, and we was about a half a mile away. While I'm moving that machine off, everybody's about a half a mile away from me, So I got it off of there, and then they blasted it, and man, it shot a column up in the air, and they said there must have been 3.5 cases to 4 cases of dynamite buried here.
We were digging out a car out of a train that had a missile on it, and you could tell by the markings. And we picked it up and we were going to hand it off to a BN crew. And we were doing everything very carefully and very slowly and not having any problems. And when we hooked up to the BN crew and my pinner or foreman pulled the pin on the locomotive and we backed up, I hollered on the radio, "Bombs away." And I was just kidding, we don't have it no more, and we're backing up, and I go, "Bombs away," and back up, and next thing you know, there's 3 guys in a military Jeep, and they want to talk to me, and then one of our managers shows up, and they go, "Why would you say something like that?" And I said, "Come on, lighten up, this job's hard enough as it is." I was always clowning around on the radio, that's kind of what I did,
Sounds like there was a lot of characters working in the railroad.
Everybody just about is a character on the railroad.
This compilation is a sample of 37 individual interviews and 3 roundtable discussions, dozens of hours preserved at the American Heritage Center. These stories are accessible to researchers, educators, and the community. During the project, AHC archivist Leslie Wagoner and project assistant Tana Leibold spoke with 8 women who worked in train and engine service, 8 Hispanic employees, 1 Native American man with a 40-year career, and gathered histories of women who worked for UP during World War II. They also interviewed family members who grew up in UP section houses from the 1940s to 1960s and heard from railroaders working within a variety of different craft areas. Visit the American Heritage Center in Laramie, Wyoming to learn more.